So what I have here is a collection of snare drums that are actively being used, either when I'm playing live or when I'm asked to do some recording in a studio. If I've done a review on any of them, I'll leave a card at the top of each one and you can hear the sound samples that are in the review. So let's start off with the Olive Wood. Now, this is definitely a high-end snare. It's from a company called Drum Art. They're based over in Italy. This is a 14 by 6.5 snare drum. It's a solid wood stave drum. So it's completely handmade. Now it's very, very thick. And that's great if you want to get that loud crack out of your snare drum. It has that natural, very light brown color that olive wood can give. Very, very smooth to the touch. And I think those long lugs look really great on it. Olive wood will generally give you a very bright sound. And I generally describe the sound of this snare drum as being very transparent. And it's something that you really have to hear to understand. And it's something that only olive wood can give that kind of a sound. I've only had it about 2 years, but for me it's a very special drum. So 12 years ago I was on holiday in London and I came across this vintage 1950s snare drum from Carlton, Dallas, London. I picked it up in a place called Tom's Drum Store and I think it was £80 at the time. And then now it's not completely original. I did have to replace the throw off and the wires, but other than that, it's everything on it is original, from the lugs to the rim to the badge. It's a nice looking snare drum. It's birch, so it's going to be quite loud. The full name for this is the Carlton Cracker. And when you hear it, it sounds like a firecracker going off. It's quite responsive, especially when you're talking about the snare wires. I don't use it enough, really. It could be used a lot more, but it's just a little bit difficult when you've got the original the tuning screws, which is just very difficult to tune an awful lot. But I bring it out to the odd jazz gig and it's always good to have in the studio. We may as well stick with the piccolos. So this is the same depth as the vintage drum, just 1 inch shorter in diameter. This is the Pearl 13 by 3 steel piccolo snare drum. To be honest with you, I would sell this in a heartbeat and get a higher end snare drum, something like a nice DW piccolo. I just find it very, very boring. Everything from a boring black color, boring lugs. I can get very little sound out of it. What I do is I crank it up to the max and I can get that real metal, pingy piccolo sound that you want to get, and it does that very well. People have said that they like the sound out of it. I'll probably sell it this year, and really that's all I've got to say about this one. Okay, so this is the bronze snare. This is the Gretsch 14 by 6.5 bronze. It's still newish for me. I bought it the tail end of 2019, and since 2020 was a complete write-off, it's only been used at a handful of gigs and a good few live streams, but it looks great on stage. Great finish, great color on it. It's definitely a high-end snare with high-end features. You should check out the throw-off. It's just amazing what you can pull out of the snare just from the throw-off alone. The range that it has is really, really amazing. If you ever get a chance to try it out, definitely try it out. You know, bronze for me is a real rock and roll sound, and this is the rock and roll snare for me. Like when you hit a rim shot with this, it's like getting smacked in the face with the solid bronze cube, but you know about it when you're hitting those rim shots. But yeah, definitely looking forward to taking this out, playing around with it a little bit more in 2021. The Drumcraft snare is about 10 years old, I think. This is the Drumcraft 14 by 4 maple snare drum. That finish is Scottish burst. This I bought as a drum kit. This was the snare that came with it, and the drum kit itself was limited to 50. So there's only 50 of that particular drum kit in the world. It means there's only 50 of these snare drums with that particular finish. So that's always very, very cool. I'd never sell it singularly. It would have to be sold as part of the drum kit. That hardware is lovely. It's in between the black and the standard, so they call that burnt finished, and that was the style that they went with at that time. This wouldn't be one of my favorite snare drums, but there's a good crack out of it. You get that very standard maple sound. It definitely serves a purpose. The absolute monster. This is the Pearl Vinnie Paul 14 by 8 maple snare drum. This was my first proper snare drum I ever bought. This got me into good quality snare drums. It's an absolute monster. At the time, the 8 inches in depth was the deepest snare drum, I should say, that Pearl ever released. It was 2007, 2008 when I bought this. At the time, I was playing with a lot of original heavy metal bands, a lot of original punk bands that got thrown into the back of Ford Transits and Ford Couriers and got driven around the island of Ireland and some of the UK. So a lot of history in this drum for me. Visually, I think it speaks for itself. It's very intimidating with that snake skin. It's got spikes coming out of the lugs. It's very, very heavy metal. But the interesting thing is how versatile this snare drum is. The tuning range in it is massive. It's huge. So you can get a lot out of this snare drum, and it suits so many different styles. You wouldn't think of it to look at it, but you can play a real good waltz on this. You can play some country music. You can play funk. You can play rock. You can play metal. It's amazing the different styles that you can play on this. It's definitely a classic snare drum. I think people will be talking about it for years and years to come, and it's one that I don't think I'd ever really be able to part with. So we'll finish up with this Ash snare drum, and it's a funny snare because it's the cheapest one in the collection, and it's also the most sought after snare drum when I'm in the studio. So this is the Gretsch 13x7 Ash snare drum. And I love playing this snare live. It's very light, very thin. It's got a nice natural finish. But Ash is a fantastic wood. Ash really is a great sounding wood. You get a very fat, very dry, a very cracky sound out of this snare drum. And it's so funny because I can go into a studio and I'll bring the olive snare, I'll bring a very expensive maple one, a very expensive birch snare drum. And 9 times out of 10, the producer or the engineer will pick this snare drum out rather than the expensive ones. You know, looking at this from like a business standpoint, looking at these instruments as tools, this certainly has earned its keep. It's definitely worth the price tag, certainly worth its weight in gold. And it just goes to show you that you don't have to spend huge amounts of money on a snare drum for it to be a good quality sounding snare drum. So that's the collection, guys. Please let me know down in the comment section what you have in your snare drum collection. Make sure you hit a like on the video, and if you haven't subscribed, subscribe to the channel. And sure, look, I'll see you next week. Take it easy, guys. Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Guys, hit me up on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter. And if you like what you've seen here today, you can see a lot more videos. Just click on any of them here on the screen.